I think maybe a more charitable way of thinking about the guys who are looking for one last shot is that, they were still doing the thing that mattered most to them in their lives, and they still felt like they had, room for growth, room for improvement. I'm not saying anything new here. I say this about professional athletes, but it's a sad fact that maybe we forget because it's in front of us all the time. But it's a strange life these guys lead. I mean, they give their all to this one particular skill, and then at a point in their lives when most people are just beginning to take off in their careers are winding down. Their skills are deteriorating. And I really enjoyed spending time around these guys in their 30s and 40s who were still trying to get better at this thing that had been so important to them for so many years.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hello, everybody. It's Tim Hanlon, your congenial host here on Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that we like to use as our exploration into what used to be in professional sports. Thank you for joining us. Again, if it's your first time here, we welcome you. Hopefully, we will entertain you for a bit. If you're a return visitor, we thank you, of course, for coming back and telling all your friends to do so as well. Today, a very fun episode, and we do our best to keep them as fun and as interesting as possible. Our guest today is author David Whitford, and currently a writer for Inc. magazine and a longtime journalist in both business and sports. But today we are going back to a book that he wrote in 1990. I believe it was originally published, that is no longer in print. However, you will hear and see why we hopefully can get it back into print. The book is called Extra Innings, A Season in the Senior League. And the discussion today is going to be around the baseball league that existed from 1989 to 1990, 91-ish or so, about a year and a half, a season and a half, called the Senior Professional Baseball Association, SPBA, or otherwise sort of more colloquially known as the Senior League. A very interesting experiment in a senior circuit for pro baseball players at the time, or at least during the origins of it, ages 35 and older, with just a who's who of stars, baseball stars from the 70s and 80s, who graced the fields of mostly Florida, although in the second year, they also had a couple of franchises in San Bernardino and in Sun City out in Arizona. But I mean, in this conversation with David, we'll talk about some very memorable players and their journeys, both before and during their time in the Senior Professional League. Wayne Garland, we talk about Tim Stoddard, Danny Boone, Earl Weaver, the founder, Jim Morley, Curt Flood, who was the commissioner. You have to remember that in the late 80s, early 90s, when this league was sort of up and running, experimental as it might have been, very star-studded. You had people like Fergie Jenkins and Bill Matlock and Vida Blue and Mickey Rivers, Greg Nettles, Raleigh Fingers. We talk a little bit about Joaquin Andujar, Bobby Bonds. I mean, Bill Spaceman Lee. I mean, Earl Weaver, as mentioned before, legendary Baltimore Orioles manager, managed in the SPBA, a senior league. So it's a fascinating conversation, a very interesting league that didn't last for too long, but that's what we specialize here on this little podcast. And David Whitford, he says, the author of the book about it called Extra Innings, A Season in the Senior League, is our guest, and we'll talk about it in a couple of seconds. A reminder, of course, that we are again sponsored by our friends at Audible. And if you enjoy a good audiobook, and who doesn't these days, the place to give it a try is through our little web URL, and that's called audibletrial.com/goodseats. And that is the place where you can enjoy a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial of the Audible service. You can cancel at any time. I think it's an important thing to underline, and it's kind of a no-risk proposition. At the very least, you're going to get a free audiobook download to enjoy for 30 days on your device. And, if you're not hooked, just then cancel it and you're done. But I suspect that you will find it to be very, very interesting, considering that there are in excess of 180,000 titles to choose from the Audible service in just about every genre that one can imagine. From nonfiction to fiction and all the various sub-variants of fiction out there. They play on just about every device that you can think of as well. And it's just an all-around good way to kill time when you're traveling or just you're otherwise occupied, but your mind is not. A good audiobook is good for the soul. It's good for you, so give it a try. It's audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 30-day trial of the Audible service and, of course, your free audiobook download. Give it a try. We appreciate it. We get a little scratch for it, and we certainly appreciate Audible for hanging in with us as we get our little journey more substantially underway in our pursuit of things and teams and leagues and stories around leagues and people and teams and all that stuff in professional sports that are no longer with us for whatever reason. And a key example of that is our current conversation. David Whitford, the author of Extra Innings, a season in the Senior League, that is the Senior Professional Baseball Association from the late 80s, early 90s, coming up right here on the podcast. You know, so far, I think we're up to 29, 30 episodes so far, and I'm just frankly amazed at how we touch on certain teams and leagues and people and whatnot, and while they don't all resonate with everybody all the time, they do resonate with bunches of people in each individual time. And I suspect that the Senior Professional Baseball Association is absolutely going to be one of those things. And I guess maybe we will attempt again to start with perhaps giving our audience a bit of a sense of how you came across this league. And it, I guess, was a job assignment, but maybe you could sort of step back and sort of put a frame around your life at the time and how the SPBA came into your life. Sure.
First of all, I'm just really glad to have a chance to talk to you about this. It was a magical experience, this league, and my own personal experience being able to write about it. And I'm always happy to talk about it. The Senior Professional Baseball Association, what we all call the Senior League, with small L for league, came about in the late 1990s. The late 1980s, 89. I had spent most of the 80s working on staff as a writer for Sport magazine. I covered all sports, but baseball was my favorite. And I had recently left sport. I'd gone down to Texas to write a book about the football recruiting scandal at SMU. And I was looking for another book project, and I caught wind of this new league that was starting up right away that fall in 1989. It was started by an entrepreneur, a real estate developer, a young guy. I think he was still in his 20s at the time. And his big idea was, look, people love to go to or love to see old-timers games, like to see retired players come back and play. And he thought, the problem with these old-timers games is they only last a few innings. What if we put together a real league? And, we were looking not for the decrepit old ball players, but guys, the minimum age in this league was 35. You had to be at least 35 years old and have played in the big leagues. They made a slightly lower cutoff for catchers. And he said, let's bring these guys together, see if we can get enough people, enough former big league players to put together some teams. We'll site the teams in Florida spring training cities. At the time, for instance, the Red Sox were training in Winter Haven, so they came up with a team called the Winter Haven Super Sox, and it was made up of a lot of old Red Sox players. And the same thing around the other teams around the league. And put together a 3-month season, play in the winter time at the spring training sites, and see what we can get going here. And that was it's an intoxicating idea that I thought, damn, this sounds great. I want to know more about what's going on, and that led to a book contract and 3 months during the winter of 1989 and 90 in Florida, watching the games and talking to the ball players.
So this was a book assignment for you. This was basically, you were essentially being assigned to, I guess, sort of take part and observe the league in its fledglingness, if that's a word, as well as during the season, and I guess opine on the people and the process and the fans and just the whole aura of the whole thing.
Yeah, it was partly a business story about this guy's entrepreneurial dream, but mainly Well, and I guess partly also a story about the games. But I didn't make any attempt to be comprehensive in that way. This ended up being was a book of stories, a book of sort of mini profiles of players that I had grown up following in the 60s and 70s, and some of which I'd lost track of. And I was amazed when I started looking down the roster and seeing who was going to be involved in this league. Earl Weaver as a manager, Bill Lee as a player manager, Vida Blue, Randy Bass, if you remember this guy, had a great big bat, struck out a lot, became a hero in Japan, but he came back and played in this league. Joaquin Andahar, Bernie Carbo, Wayne Garland, who signed one of the first, I think he may have signed the first $1 million contract of anybody in baseball. Walt No Neck Williams, Doc Ellis. I mean, there were just a lot of great names. And at that point, I had spent a fair amount of time in major league clubhouses as a reporter and, down on the field talking to players. Enough time to know that baseball players have lots of great stories, and the pressure of performing in the big leagues is not conducive to them sharing those stories. And my thought was, if I can get down there in this sort of low pressure environment and spend some time with people who had been in the spotlight but weren't anymore, that I might be able to get some good stories out of it and some good profiles. So that was my ambition.
So as you got to meet and greet and see these, frankly, quite legendary players, I mean, I think anybody who grew up in the 70s and 80s, would mm-hmm. know these names. A whole bunch of them Hall of Famers as well. Was there any general sort of coalescence of the types of stories, or were they as individual as the people themselves?
Well, everybody has their own story, of course, right? But there were, I think, sort of two broad categories of who was down there and why they were there. And maybe if you're interested, I could read a couple of passages from the book. I mean, the simple way to think about it is that there were sad stories and there were happy stories. I think that Jim Morley, who was the founder of this league, the sort of basic miscalculation that he made was, financial miscalculation, was that he was going to have to pay players, have to pay these guys a fair amount of money if they were going to give up whatever they were doing and go down to Florida and play in this league. And what turned out to be the case is that, this was in the days before big league baseball players could count on lucrative pensions. And there were a lot of guys down there who had nothing else going on. And one of the ones who fell into that category was Wayne Garland. As I mentioned before, he signed one of the first really big contracts in baseball, although in retrospect it wasn't that much. I think they called it $1 million contract, but it was $1 million over 5 years or 10 years or something like that. So, once it came right down to it, it wasn't that much. It certainly didn't turn him into a wealthy man. And by the time the senior league came along, he was washed up and he had no money left. And I watched him pitch a couple of times. He got roughed up, and on one of those occasions, I went and saw him afterwards in the clubhouse, and he was in obvious pain. And, his shoulder was a wreck. He had a pinched vertebrae at some point, and so I went to talk to his manager, Pat Dobson, and to ask Dobson, why'd you pitch him if he was hurting so much? And let me just read for a moment here from my conversation with Pat Dobson about Wayne Garland.
Please.
So I walk into the clubhouse, and I ask Pat Dobson, what's wrong with Garland? I asked him. I think he's got bursitis now is what he's got. That can probably hurt as much as the rotator cuff thing. I've been through that. A lot of times I'd end up getting it sleep funny, and get one of those vertebrae pinched in here. Dobson reached back and touched the top of his spine. And it cuts off the fluid in your bursa sac, and your fucking bones just grind together. He's going to see a chiropractor on Monday. Should he have started that game 2 days ago, I asked. Well, I know he was hurting before, and he's been hurting for quite a while, but he still wanted to pitch. When he does that for you and goes out there, you hope you can let him pitch 5 innings and get him a win. I would have hated like hell to have him get out of there with no decision or a loss. I was going to bunt for 1 run to try to get him a win. As it turned out, we ended up starting the inning with a double and got a 2-out double to score the run and got the lead and won the game, and he got the win. So it really worked out nicely, you know. I realize now that I'd read the situation all wrong. Dobson wasn't using Garland. He was looking out for him. The only part I still didn't understand was what was driving Garland, why pitching still mattered so much to him. I know there was a lot at stake in the big leagues, I said, but that's over. I'm puzzled why a guy like Wayne Garland still wants to put himself through all the pain and disappointment. Dobson was sitting in a swivel chair. He leaned way back in it now and regarded me blankly through a blue veil of cigarette smoke. He sighed, and then he undertook to explain. Yeah, but not knowing what his financial condition is, how do you know that there's not as much at stake now as there was then? Dobson leaned forward again. That's the point. You see, he doesn't have a job in baseball right now. He doesn't have anything else to do beside what he's doing right now. He can pitch for me anytime he wants to. As long as he wants to go out there, I'm going to let him pitch. He can use his own judgment on whether he thinks he can permanently hurt himself or whatever, but as long as he's capable of pitching, he'll pitch for me anytime. I know what kind of financial condition he's in. I have a pretty good idea what financial condition most of these guys are in. See, a lot of times you may just go an extra mile with a guy and try to get him over the hump, because I know it's not easy. I've been there myself. And when I got out and had to get into coaching, I was making $15,000 a year. It's not easy. So that situation that Wayne Garland in was typical of what a lot of these guys were in. And that gave things a kind of, I don't know, a tinge of, I don't know, this was real life. It wasn't a game anymore. If it ever was a game for professional baseball players. But in this case, it was not. They were doing what they could to earn a living.
Yeah, that story is particularly striking because Garland was released by the Indians in early 1982. And you're talking about a gap of, 6.5, 7 years from actually playing professional ball to come back, despite his health issues. That's right. A long gap, and he wasn't one of the more successful pitchers down there in the league. He was, but I think what it came down to is that he really couldn't think about any other way to make a living. How about on the flip side? You mentioned the positive stories. Any of those that stick out in your mind from your scribing, if you will, of the season of 1989? Yeah, let me see if I can pull one of these stories out here. I have always been sympathetic to players who keep going, rather than players who, whose ambition is to quit at the top of the game. And I thought I had marked that story here. Maybe we should go on to another question, and I'll pull it out when I can find it. Sure. And I think it's also helpful for our audience to know again, and we will obviously talk about this on a regular basis here. But the book is called Extra Innings: A Season in the Senior League. It's by our guest David Whitford, and it was published originally by HarperCollins. It is out of print, but my hope is obviously one, you can find it as a used copy on lots of different places in our modern internet world. But perhaps a few listeners out there who are in the publishing space might take to the story and maybe think about reissuing it because this is a whole bunch of stories that are really compelling and really interesting, and you hate to lose these to time, especially given all the major players and coaches that were part of this experiment back in the late 80s, early 90s. Tim, let me. I have located the story that I wanted to reference here, and I think it's appropriate to tell it now as just sort of a kind of bookend to the story about Wayne Garland. And this one is about Tim Stoddard.
who came down to pitch and had good success in the senior league. He had played as recently as the summer before, pitched for the Cleveland Indians, but they let him go at the end of the season. And now he's 36 years old, and he's coping with the realization that his career in all likelihood is over. And he runs down to pitch in the senior league to see if he can drum up some interest again. So I asked him, why are you doing this? What's your motivation? And it's fun, he said right away. Oops, wrong answer. Okay, not wrong, incomplete. I mean, you play this game your whole life. It becomes a part of you. It's just the fact that you've been an athlete since you were 6 or 7 years old. You thrive on competition and trying to win. Maybe you could do the same thing, joining a bowling league or a dart league or whatever. But when you specialize in something, it's a lot more fun playing against the guys that have been your competition and your peers the whole time. You accept the fact that you're not what you were when you were 22. I know I'm not going to be as good as I once was. I know I can't throw the ball 95 miles an hour anymore. But I know I sure know how to pitch. And I know these guys know how to hit. Going out there thinking it's a joke. Every day I pitch, even now, I learn more about the game. Last time we were here, I got knocked out. We ended up winning the game, but I think for me it was the only bad day down here. I was throwing the ball good. I was throwing hard, but it was the way I pitched and the way I let things happen to me out there. Get in ruts sometimes. Go to one pitch that 10 years ago was your main pitch, but now maybe you have to go to the breaking ball. So you try to learn by that, just like you did when you were 20 years old. To me, Stoddard's attitude about playing in the senior league was the opposite of not wanting to grow up. The point, as I understood him, was not to relive the past. The point was to keep living, growing, learning, developing the craft that had been the object of his interest and devotion ever since he was a child. If the end of an athlete's career was like dying, then to quit while you felt you were still making progress was to commit suicide. Mike Schmidt, who probably retired before his skill was spent, was praised for exiting with dignity and grace. Steve Carlton, who let his talent burn down to the last red ember, was reviled. But which one had more courage?
So Stoddard's especially interesting because he was one of the handful of folks that played in the league and actually then went back to Major League Baseball afterwards.
Yeah, there were a few in that category who got at least another shot. Wayne Garland not among them. Paul Mirabella was a middle reliever who and an occasional starter for the Palm Beach Tropics in the league. Went to camp with the Brewers the following spring, made the team, appeared in 44 games. Ozzie Virgil went back for a little bit. Ron Washington went back for a little bit. Roy Thomas went back for a little bit. Joaquin Andujar went to spring training, got cut before the Expos went north. But, one of the best, most intriguing cases down there was a fellow named Dan Boone. Do you remember Dan Boone?
Sure. Go ahead. Tell our audience about him.
He was not the shortest guy to ever play Major League Baseball, but he was pretty close. I think he claimed to be 5'8". I mean, shortest pitcher. He claimed to be 5'8", and I think that was a little bit of an exaggeration. He had been, I think a regular fastball, breaking ball pitcher when he played in the big leagues, and then he was out for a long time. I think he was installing kitchen flooring when he found out about the senior league. And what he had been doing during the time he was out of baseball was working on a new pitch, and that was a knuckleball. And he had great success in the senior league. He got signed by Oil scout Bertie Tebbetts. Bertie Tebbetts, the legendary Bertie Tebbetts, at the end of that of the senior league. Orioles assigned him to Rochester, their AAA affiliate, finished the season there, and on September 1st, 1990, 8 years after he had last pitched in major leagues, Boone was recalled by the Orioles. He appeared in 4 games, including his first career major league start, no decision against Cleveland. And after the season, he played winter ball with the Orioles' top prospects in the Dominican Republic. I don't think he made it back the following year to the big leagues, but what a great story he was, and had everybody in the league cheering for him, including Bertie Tebbetts.
Would you say most of the players were, it seems like it seems like it kind of divided into half. Like some of them were essentially, looking for the last flicker or ember of success or for fame or whatever as their careers were winding down. And some others who were, essentially looking for one last shot, thinking that they had something left in the tank. Is that another way to maybe divide most of the players as they approach the senior league?
Yeah, and I think maybe a more charitable way of thinking about the guys who are looking for one last shot is that, they were still doing the thing that mattered most to them in their lives, and they still felt like they had, room for growth, room for improvement. I mean, I'm not saying anything new here to say this about professional athletes, but it's a sad fact that that maybe we forget after because it's in front of us all the time. But it's a strange life these guys lead. I mean, they give their all to this one particular skill, and then at a point in their lives when most people are just beginning to take off in their careers are winding down. Their skills are deteriorating. And I really enjoyed spending time around these guys in their 30s and 40s who were still trying to get better at this thing that had been so important to them for so many years.
Well, it's life defining, right? And the interesting, sometimes sad, sometimes happy transition from once that recognition occurs as to then what one then segues to for the quote unquote rest of their lives. And, for a lot of professional athletes, and we've scratched a little bit of this in some of our journeys into forgotten teams and leagues and stuff. A lot of folks have a very difficult time with that. And you could make the argument that the Senior Professional Baseball Association was, almost like an extension of the inevitable. And it just delayed the sort of reckoning that some of these players ultimately had to come to about their, the end of their professional careers.
Yeah, probably so. Yeah, there was maybe only a handful of guys went on from the senior league and got another chance to extend their careers. Maybe some of them went down there thinking that the senior league was going to be a regular thing every winter. I mean, certainly that was the founder's ambition. His hope was that they would put together get a good TV contract, and that would lead to sponsorship deals, and it would be the kind of thing that came back year after year and provided an opportunity for these guys deep into retirement in sort of the same way that the senior golf tour does for older golfers. But that speaks to another sort of fundamental problem with this league, and that's the quality of play. I think no one really knew how this was going to turn out if you put these older guys on the field and you had them play every day and you had them play regular 9-inning games. How were things going to turn out? I have another short passage here I could read on the quality of play. I think it might shed some light on that.
Absolutely. It's one of my next questions.
Okay. So here's one night where I was out at a game somewhere. I think I was in St. Petersburg. The first inning of the middle game of the series, Lenny Randall, if you remember him, made an acrobatic play at second base. It came when Toby Harrah hit a hard shot straight up the middle. The pitcher Milt Wilcox deflected but couldn't handle. The ball skidded to the right side of the infield. Randall, who had broken to his right at the crack of the bat, abruptly changed direction, scooped up the ball, and made a shovel toss to Dave Rasich at first, just in time to catch Harrah. It was a sort of play, graceful play that Major League second basemen make all the time. But seeing it made me realize how few like it I'd seen over the last 3 weeks. There was a lot of speculation about where to put the senior league in the hierarchy of baseball. Was it the equivalent of college ball, AAA? Willie Aikens came to the senior league from the Mexican League, and he thought the two were comparable, with some players good enough to be in the big leagues and others who probably wouldn't make it at any level in pro ball. That said, most of the games, most of the time, looked to me like the real thing. Obviously, no one in the senior league could run as fast as Rickey Henderson, but then no one could make the throw from short like Sean Dunston either. The weaknesses were relative and tended to cancel each other out. The balance of the game was largely preserved. Triples, rare in any league, were a case in point. With so few speedsters in the senior league, you wouldn't expect to see many triples at all. In fact, senior leaguers ended up hitting 154 triples for the season, or 2.5% of all hits, exactly the same percentage as were hit in the major leagues in 1988, and almost the same as in the other years I looked at. Still, defense generally and infield play in particular were the areas where players tended to show their age. A hard-hit ball in the senior league jumped off the bat as violently as a hard-hit ball in the big leagues, and when it did, infielders were sometimes slow to react. Baseball is a game of sharp angles, straight lines, till a ball comes skidding through the infield at 50 miles per hour. And then anything can happen, and it takes not only quick reflexes, but confidence to stay with the ball and make the play. In the senior league, you saw too many ground balls pass through the wickets, and not enough plays like Randall's at second, with mid-course correction and improvised solutions. So, I think that is probably one of the major reasons why this failed as a business, is that while it was pretty thrilling for some of the retired people who were in Florida in the wintertime to go out and see players that they remembered seeing in the big leagues, the games themselves didn't have the quality of play to hold people's attention night after night. Not enough people anyway.
Okay, friends, sorry for the interruption. Just wanted to quickly remind you that today's episode of Good Seats Still Available is brought to you by our friends at Audible, the premier provider of digital audiobooks with over 180,000 titles to choose from in just about every genre you could think of. Audible titles play on iPhone, Kindle, Android, and more than 500 devices and MP3 players for listening anytime, anywhere. And for a limited time, my audience can listen to a free download of any book that they choose, as well as get a 30-day free trial when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And you can choose from over 180,000 titles, as we said, including one that I'm listening to right now. It's called The 10-Gallon War by John Eisenberg. That's the story of the NFL's Cowboys, the AFL's Texans, and the feud for Dallas's pro football future. Another one on my list, which I have yet to download but is on my queue, that could be interesting to our audience here, is called The National Forgotten League by Dan Daly, entertaining stories and observations from pro football's first 50 years. Those are just two of the many thousands of titles to choose from, and not just in sports history, but you name the genre that you might want to listen to, and Audible's got it. By the way, two guests perhaps that we'll have on the show, hopefully sometime soon. But again, go to audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 30-day trial, as well as your free audiobook download to try it out for yourself. Again, that's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now, back to our conversation. Give me a sense of how you approached this project, because some of this prose is just absolutely tremendous and captures a lot of. And by the way, this book, Extra Innings, is just chock full of this kind of writing and these kinds of stories, and they kind of blend together just sort of brilliantly. Give us a sense of how you approach this from a method perspective. Like, did you go to all the games and all the teams? Did you kind of just like sit with one team and travel with them across? What was the sort of mechanics of how you sort of got all these stories and put all your thoughts together?
Well, the season started on Halloween, if I recall. I got down there a day or so after the first game. This whole thing came together very quickly. And it was going to go for the next 3 months. So, as I said, they were playing in cities that were spread out all around Florida. And I went and rented an apartment on Passagrille Beach outside of St. Petersburg. There seemed to be a pretty good central location. And I made it my business, got a schedule, made it my business to go to the games. I'd go to at least one game a day. Sometimes I'd go to two, and I think on a couple of occasions I even made it to three, a couple of afternoon games, and then drove across the state to see a night game. I had tremendous access. There were some local reporters who were covering. There was another guy who was following one team, the St. Petersburg Pelicans, and writing only about them. But basically, there weren't a lot of reporters hanging around. And the players themselves, this was a low, for some of them, it was serious business and the stress was high. But for the most part, it was not the same kind of pressure that they had been facing when they were professional ball players, full-time professional ball players, and trying to hang on in the big leagues. So they were more open to conversation. And, baseball players are great at telling stories. There's a lot of sitting around. There's plenty of time, for thoughtful conversation, whether they're sitting in the dugout before the game or back in the clubhouse. And ball players are interesting people. They've been all over the world, playing in winter leagues and throughout the Caribbean, or some of them, a lot of guys in this league had come back from Japan. There are people who, for the most part, left home at an early age, devoted themselves entirely to this long shot, goal. If you can, so I would wander into the clubhouse or down to the field, and I'd look for people I recognized and try to engage them in conversation. And that's a tough thing to do during a major league season. But this, was a situation where people opened up and were all too happy to talk to me. Also, these are people who were used to being in the spotlight, and I think some of them missed having a reporter come up to them and say, tell me your story. That's a very seductive opening line, and a lot of people are all too happy to engage with you if you ask them to tell you their story.
So most of the major markets in Florida, we talk about St. Petersburg and Orlando, West Palm, suburbs of Miami, St. Lucie, some of the training camp facilities. These are obviously the sort of major ports of call within the state of Florida. Were there many beat reporters covering this league on a full-time basis, or were you kind of, one of the only sort of persistent, folks out there kind of chronicling what was going on?
There were a couple others. A guy named Tom Jones, who still writes for the St. Petersburg Times. He was covering the St. Pete team. It's funny, the three beat reporters I remember were Tom Jones, Glenn Miller, and Mike Jackson. Not the Glenn Miller and Michael Jackson that you're thinking of, but there they were. That was their names. There was also a guy, Randy Wayne White, who was I spent a fair amount of time with. He was on assignment for Playboy writing about the league. And Randy Wayne White is now a very successful novelist and writes mysteries about Sanibel Island. There were a Sports Illustrated reporter showed up at one point. I think there was a piece that ran in SI. People, bouncing in and out every now and then. But as far as covering the season, covering the whole thing on a daily basis, it was just a couple of us.
How about the fans? How much of that was part of your experience, your interviews? You kind of alluded to it before. There clearly were not a lot of them. I think during that first season, the average attendance for the then 8-team Senior Professional Baseball Association was slightly less than 1,000 per game. I have to think that was below what the founders were thinking. And I'm just curious as to sort of what the composition of the fans who did come were and their attachment to this.
Well, I think, St. Pete had pretty good attendance. That team was good, and they had a nice ballpark right downtown and, close to a fairly large metropolitan area. Some of the other ballparks were, Winter Haven, Fort Myers at the time, not so big. It turned out to be a winter that was unusually cold. I think they made a calculation based on averages, and then turned out that winter was the temperatures were below average. I can remember a lot of games going deep into the night, and it's about 40 degrees, and wind picks up a little bit, and that's not really where you want to be, sitting out at a ballpark watching the game under those conditions. So I think that kept the fans away. It was mostly retirees, which I think was the goal. That was part of the plan, part of the business plan for the senior league, is that we're going to draw fans from a group of people who knew these guys when they were playing in the big leagues. But really, they turned out to be quite lonely games. And my focus was with the players. Sometimes I'd go down into the stands. Be a situation where a foul ball would end up in the stands sometimes, and instead of everybody rushing for it, you might not bother to get up until the inning was over, and then you just go walk over and pick up the ball. My focus was on the players themselves, and my memories when I look back now had to do with standing around the batting cage, or in the clubhouse, or the week that I spent traveling with Bill Lee's team, the Winter Haven Super Sox. Watched a couple of those games from the dugout.
What was Bill Spaceman Lee like? Was he truly, did he live up to his name?
Yeah, absolutely. He's, I think he may still be playing ball in some kind of semi-pro league in northern Vermont. He was a misfit when he was in the big leagues, and he was a misfit also in the senior league. I think a lot of his teammates kind of rolled their eyes. But Bill Lee loves baseball with a passion that exceeds, I think, that of most ball players. I mean, his love of the game, I think, allows him to connect and resonate more strongly sometimes with fans than it does with fellow ball players.
So besides the players and a couple of the managers that you sort of hinted at, there's a couple of other interesting characters in this story, one of whom is Curt Flood, memorable for his sizable contribution to how players and the league work and negotiate with each other. But he was the first and only, I think, commissioner of this league. Any remembrances of Curt Flood in all of this?
Yeah, Curt Flood, I mean, to Jim Morley's credit, he made Curt Flood, appointed him as commissioner, as you say. And I think that was partly a way to sort of signal to players, people who might be interested in playing in this league, that this was a serious venture, and that one of their own was in charge. Curt Flood, just to remind people if they've forgotten, is responsible in a large part for the dismantling of the reserve clause in baseball. He was traded from the Cardinals to the Phillies and refused to report, and that ended up sort of destroying what was left of a quite brilliant career. And I had written about him a few years earlier for Sport Magazine on the occasion of our 40th anniversary issue at Sport Magazine. And this was in the early 80s, mid 80s. And he was actually pretty hard to track down back then. This was in the pre-internet days. And when I found him, I thought it was kind of a sad story. He, a fascinating human being, a very skilled artist, somebody who read widely and had been, at the top of his profession, a World Series hero, and then very suddenly, and he was on the outs and ran out of money. He ended up in Mallorca, Spain, running a bar for a while. There was an issue with alcoholism, and the senior league was a wonderful thing for him, a chance to get back in the game. He died shortly thereafter, too young. Curt Flood was, I think, an American hero, and I hope that ball players today appreciate what he did for them.
Well, challenging the reserve clause and all the things that's led to for professional baseball players and, frankly, just the face of the game, no doubt a debt of gratitude. How do you sort of characterize his role as a commissioner of this league? Was it largely ceremonial, or did he have sort of an active hand in it? It almost feels like almost a redemption play for him when you think about it.
Yeah, I think it was more a ceremonial role than anything else. He used to show up at the games and sign autographs. On occasion, he was called upon to resolve challenges. When Earl Weaver was manager down there, and he managed down there like he managed in the big leagues, and he was always getting into fights with umpires and playing games under protest. So those would go to Curt Flood for resolution. But it was mainly a ceremonial role. Weaver was one of my favorite guys down there. If you'd like, I could read a little passage about a conversation I had with him.
Sure. And for our audience, I mean, you never know how young or old or memories people. So a tiny bit of background about who Earl Weaver was before he became part of this senior league would be probably helpful too.
Yeah, he was a longtime manager of the Baltimore Orioles, and during the great Oriole teams of the 70s in particular. And he was famous for his fights with umpires. I mean, it occurred to me the other day that this new rule that in baseball, the replay rule, has basically eliminated, what used to be such a big part of the game, and that's the umpire coming running out of the dugout and getting into a big fight. I mean, the manager running out of the dugout to get into a big fight with the umpire. Now that everything's resolved by instant replay, it's sort of taken that thing away. But Weaver was, I don't know if he set the all-time record for getting thrown out of games, but if he didn't, he came close.
Well, he certainly was also probably the most creative and original guy in his abilities to dispute plays and issues with umpires over the years, for sure.
That's right. Kicking dirt onto home plate, or throwing bases around, or whatever he had to do to get people's attention. So I went down and saw him. One of the first conversations I had with him, and during this, we talked several times over the course of the season. But I'll read here for just a moment. Weaver spent 20 years in the minor leagues, hanging around long past the point when it would have made more sense for him to quit. It wasn't until he finally gave up trying to make it as a second baseman and got into managing that he even progressed beyond Double-A. In a lot of ways, what with the old parks, the crummy lights, the small crowds, and the cramped dressing rooms, managing in the senior league was like going back to the minor leagues all over again. Main difference being that this time around, Weaver was almost 60 years old. But evidently, Weaver didn't see it that way. Not even the prospect of riding the buses again seemed to worry him. Travel shouldn't be no problem at all, he said. I guess the longest trip is Bradenton at 5 hours, like a trip from Baltimore to the West Coast, but that's the longest one. The other ones are 2.5 hours. The buses have VCRs. You see a movie and you're done. But we got our first long road trip coming up. I call it long. I'll spend 2 days at home for Thanksgiving, then go to Bradenton, then it's 6 days, and I'll see how that 6-dayer goes. I will tell you this, though. We had one night game on the road already, and that seemed like it was a week long, waiting to go to the ballpark. That's the one thing. It's the only thing so far that was distasteful. I asked him, what town were you in? He says, Fort Myers. It don't make no difference what town. I'd rather be in Fort Myers than New York or Chicago or Detroit. Ain't no doubt about that. Thing is, it's a long day. The same old thing. You have to find something to occupy my time on the road. I'll have to find something to occupy my time on the road. That was an interesting insight to me. That to him, I don't know. I guess I never really thought about it that way before. How ball players, day after day, night after night, right? Usually it's a night game. You wake up and there's nothing to do except wait around until it's time to go back to the ballpark the next day. And that's the thing that Weaver found most distasteful about being back in the senior league. Those long days with nothing to occupy his time.
Oh, I think that's actually much broader than that. I think anybody involved in the creative arts, right? Comedians and musicians and where there's lots of road trips and tours and all that kind of stuff. It takes a serious toll on your psyche if you're not prepared to be able to, if you will, distract or otherwise engage yourself beyond sort of the moments at hand. And it is in many cases, obviously, commingled with perhaps other sort of issues in personal backgrounds, right? It can be a great undoer of of one's ability to perform at a high level on a consistent basis. It can drive people mad, literally, right? Ask any stand-up comedian will probably tell you that.
Yeah.
So when let's go back to Jim Morley again, because I also kind of want to get to sort of what you saw in the first year and perhaps a little bit of the denouement, which was the second year. Obviously not one that you were covering, but I'm sure you kept following it as it kind of crept to its demise the year after your traveling with the league. But talk about a little bit about sort of Jim Morley's, I guess, vision. You sort of hinted at it before, and perhaps maybe your interactions with him, and perhaps maybe also when you kind of knew or saw it was sort of not going to be viable, and or how those cracks started to surface during your time there.
Well, Jim was a young guy, late 20s, early 30s at the time. His business was real estate. Some of his properties were not performing the way he wanted them to. As he described it to me, at one point he was in a little bit of a cash flow crunch, and he had been sitting with his new wife on vacation on a beach in Hawaii reading about the senior golf tour. And that's when the idea occurred to him that maybe he could do something with baseball. The whole thing came together very quickly. I mean, a lot of people he talked to, thought this was just a great idea. The idea was to, generate fan interest and at some point get a big television contract. So he was, someone who is by nature optimistic and a promoter and a marketeer, and he kept up a happy face through most of the season, even as things were starting to collapse around him. The first indication was that attendance was not going to be what he hoped it would be. That came clear pretty early. It also, he was in the beginning of the season talking optimistically about having that television contract by the time, before the first season was over. And after a while, it was clear that that wasn't going to happen either. I've already mentioned that he realized about halfway through that he probably miscalculated on his business plan. He did not have to pay players as much as he thought he did to get them to come down there. There were a couple of owners he signed up who were, substantial people of means. John Henry, for instance, who now owns the Red Sox, was the owner of the team in West Palm Beach. And after the senior league, he bought the Florida Marlins from Wayne Heitzinger, and then came up and bought the Red Sox. But there were a couple of people in there who really didn't have the resources to do what they needed to do, including one who disappeared mysteriously about 3/4 of the way through the season. And it turned out that he was involved in some financial fraud, and he was never seen from again. So the rest of the owners had to kick in money to cover payroll for that team. Through it all, Morley did his best to remain optimistic and gave it a shot the second season. For the second season, they kept the healthiest franchises in Florida, and they started a couple of new franchises in Arizona. Arizona maybe is where they should have been all along, because I think the winter weather there is a little better than it is in Florida. But that season, they didn't make it through. They gave up the ghost about halfway through, and that was the end of the senior league.
So it's interesting you mentioned television. And by the way, you mentioned Arizona. I think it was Sun City, the Sun City Rays, and then also I think San Bernardino, which is close enough, right? As obviously a southern sort of in between LA and Arizona. But obviously a shell that is 6 teams, I guess, of versus 8 the previous season. And obviously from a travel perspective, right, adding a whole bunch of travel stuff. But it's interesting you mentioned Arizona might have been a better place for it overall, I guess, in hindsight. But you also touched on television, right? Now, that to me, that's kind of surprising. And we hear that the sort of allure and the almost importance from a business model perspective of television. Obviously, that's obvious today, of course, in our media-saturated world with so many different outlets looking for, live sports and programming. But I'm actually kind of surprised. I mean, I've heard this story many, many times in the 70s with various leagues and things that we've talked about. And clearly in the 70s, right, cable was just still very much at its infancy. But, the late 80s, early 90s, cable was a pretty established, or certainly becoming established thing. And sports was certainly growing. I mean, ESPN was, 10 years old at this time. I'm kind of curious as to why perhaps a television sort of contract, 3 months in length, right? We're not talking about a season and a huge commitment, never came about. Do you have any insight as to maybe why that sort of didn't happen?
I think that was a shock to Morley as well. It's not like no games were ever televised. There were a couple. And, I think it probably goes back fundamentally to the reason, it's related, it's not unrelated to the reason why they couldn't get people to go out to the games and sit in the stands and watch them. It's just that, maybe the concept, wasn't quite as thrilling as he thought it would be. Maybe it didn't translate, maybe baseball doesn't translate to older players competing as well as golf does, for instance, or even tennis, I suppose. Old time. It's one thing to go to the ballpark and see somebody participate in an exhibition, a couple of innings exhibition, and get a chance to get somebody's autograph. But to go out to the games, game after game, I want to see a good game, and too often the level of play just wasn't up to standards.
It almost feels to me that that there was almost a bit of a lack of, I guess, promotional flair, because you see how successful card signings and sports memorabilia shows and all that kind of stuff is. And you mentioned it before, right? A lot of the fans that came out, those that did, it's not just only hopefully to watch a fairly good quality game, but let's be honest, you had major names, right? A bunch of them Hall of Famers. That were, in their midst. And obviously you got to think that from a promotional perspective, whether that could have been, a signing after the game or mix and mingle or, sort of a kind of a fantasy camp kind of thing. I don't know. It just seems, and again, I come from a marketing and media background, so perhaps that's my bias, but it just seems almost natural that it could have been, and perhaps maybe could again, but with a more professional promotional element to it, marketing element to it, in addition to, I don't want to call it the sideshow, but the game on the field itself.
Yeah, I think you're right. And there were a couple ideas that we used to toss around in the press box that maybe they would have tried if they'd had a chance to, if they lasted a little bit longer. There were always 2 roster spots available for the basic requirement was you had to be 36 years old or 35 years old and have played in the big leagues. But they left 2 roster spots open for anybody. So they held open tryouts, and each team had a couple of guys, who'd never played big league ball, but were good enough to play in the senior league. But maybe they could have taken that concept one step further. Fantasy baseball is a big deal. So why not do a fan contest or something like that and put somebody on the field, let them play an inning in left field, whatever, and sit in the dugout during the game. That would be, I thought that would be pretty cool. Or maybe put them on the bus to let them ride with the players to the game or something like that. Anything to make that connection more intimate than it was. Because that was, to me, that was the beauty of the league, was that as a reporter, was that I got a much deeper involvement with the players than I did when I was covering big league baseball teams. And they probably could have done more on the fans' behalf in that regard as well.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. I'm not arguing with the pursuit of the purity of the game, but it just seems today that okay. Let's lead into this sort of near ending question here. Do you think something like this could exist today, or do you think this was a truly one-time experiment that will likely never see the light of day again?
Well, I think the quality of play issues are things that really can't be changed. So that may be sort of the Achilles heel of this concept. I think there may be some sports that translate and some that don't. I mean, you wouldn't think of a league for retired football players, for instance. A league for retired basketball players. I don't think that works either. Certainly these sports, level of play has gotten so high, the skills are so advanced, and that we as fans have gotten used to a standard, a kind of quality that if we don't see that, then it's not as interesting. It's kind of boring. So maybe not. This may have been a one-time thing. That's why I guess I'm so grateful that I had a chance to experience it day to day during those 3 months back in 1989. I think it was such a valuable experience.
So, David, perhaps you want to, you had some stuff to promote. I know you're obviously have a journalism day job that is treating you very well, but you're also a musician. Maybe you want to give us some background as to what you do during day and night since the time of writing this book.
Well, there's a couple of things. This book is out of print. However, if anybody wants to buy it, last time I looked on Amazon, there are copies available. There are people selling their used copies. And I'd love to get this book back into print, and maybe if there's some activity, people buying those used copies, which can be had for very cheap, then that might create some interest and get this thing back in print. That's exactly what happened with my first book, which is available. It's called A Payroll to Meet, a story, a tale of greed, corruption, and football at SMU. And it's about the football recruiting scandal during the Pony Express years in the 80s. Eric Dickerson, Greg James, Ron Myers was the coach. And if you remember, they received a death penalty as a result of egregious repeated violations of recruiting rules. That book was out of print for 20 years, and then it became the subject of a 30 for 30 ESPN documentary, which replays often. If anyone's curious, I'm sure they can find it. And that book is now available, reprinted by University of Nebraska Press, and available on Amazon. And the band stuff, I play fiddle in a Americana band. And if anybody's curious, they can search for The Social Number 11. And if they're ever in the Boston area, would love to have them come out to a show and come say hi and tell me that they found out about it on Tim Hanlon's podcast.
What's the well? Yeah, and I'm sure I'll get a cut of the gate too. Give our audience a bit of what kind of music you play and specialize in.
Well, we call it Americana music. It's roots music. It's I don't know, maybe alt country. I play fiddle. We have guitars, dobro, bass player, mandolin, accordion. It's good old American, traditional, rootsy country music.
That sounds like fun and a great soundtrack, I guess, to life itself. And your day job, we can see you and read you where?
I am a writer for Inc. magazine, INC, not INK. That's a different magazine altogether. My Inc. writes about small business and entrepreneurs. So got a story in the current issue. I think the issue that's on the stands now is our annual Inc. 500 issue, which is a list of the 500 fastest growing private companies in America. And I happen to write the story about the number one company this year. It's a company called Skillz, Skillz. And they are a platform for this burgeoning world of esports. And they publish mobile games that people can compete against one another in for cash prizes, and they've been a huge success. They're the fastest growing private company in America.
Yeah, it's amazing. I'm my day job is in the media and technology and advertising space, and I want to say maybe about 200 of those companies have felt it important enough to either email me or publish on social media that they made that list. So clearly, that list is a very buzzworthy and accolade for a lot of companies that are fledgling and and not just in digital media, but in all kinds of things. So keep an eye out for that. So Mr. Whitford, I can't thank you enough for spending time with us and again being dragged back into your late 80s, early 90s experience with the Senior Professional Baseball Association. I am amazed at the types of folks that listen to this show. I am increasingly less amazed because it's just overwhelming, the passions that we somehow touch upon or unearth. And I can't think that we won't scratch the backs of a few of folks who remember this league and maybe perhaps influentially could have some kind of role in helping get this book back into print. The stories in it are just great. It's rich. Every page is full of stories and great quotes. I mean, you heard a few excerpts from David on our podcast here, but it's called Extra Innings, a season in the Senior League, and it's a treasure. It's a great book. I've had it on my bookshelf for many years, and I highly encourage you to seek it out, and let's hope perhaps we can generate some heat to maybe get it reissued for others to enjoy on a broader basis. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to staying in touch for hopefully some more conversations, and maybe we can get something going again with this book.
Oh, thank you, Tim. You're very kind, and I enjoyed being on your podcast, and I really admire what you're doing, and hope you get to keep doing it for a long time to come. Thank you for having me.
All right, there it is. Thank you to David Whitford for a very interesting discussion about the old Senior League, the Senior Professional Baseball Association. The book that we referenced that David wrote and was published in 1991 is called Extra Innings, a season in the Senior League. It is published by Edward Burlingame Books, which is an imprint of HarperCollins. As we said on during our interview, the book is out of print. So the place that you can best find that is wherever you can find used books, whether that be places like Powell's Books or the used book environments of places like Amazon or Barnes & Noble, etc. We'll have a link to some of the better places to find that on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Of course, just look for the episode featuring David Whitford, episode number 30, and you will be able to find some links there. We, of course, are on a mission to get this book back into print. They're just some great stories, and it's an amazing little snapshot into the history of professional baseball that we don't want to lose. So anybody in the publishing industry listening to the show and want to talk about how we can maybe mutually get that underway, please, by all means, reach out. You can go to our website and find our email link there. You can hit us up on social media at Good Seats Still Available. On Instagram, you can find us on Twitter at Good Seats Still is the handle there. You'll find a page to us devoted to us on Facebook. You can hit us up there. Or as we said, email on our website, goodseatsstillavailable.com. A couple of other promo things. David mentioned his previous book, which has been reissued on University of Nebraska Press, called Payroll to Meet. That's the sort of story of the SMU football team and its travails post-blacklisting from the NCAA. That is available in print. David's writings during his day job for Inc. magazine can be found at inc.com, and 2 Twitter feeds to follow David in his other journeys in life. One is at David Whitford, WHITFORD, and the musical group, the Social Number 11, that he is part of up in Massachusetts. You can follow him on and them on Twitter at thesocialno11, as well as their website, thesocialno11.com. And the group is called the Social Number 11, and you can find them touring up in New England as well. Our thanks to David. Our thanks to you for listening. We appreciate it tremendously. We will get some shout outs to you. We promise in the weeks to come. We just need to collate all of our input, and we're just so overwhelmed by your thoughts and your reactions to the show, your suggestions, of course. And we've got a whole bunch of stuff stacked up and ready to go for future episodes. So please keep listening. Please tell your friends. Please rate and review us on iTunes or wherever you can rate and review. That helps us get some heat. And unbounded thanks. And we'll look forward to seeing you soon on our next episode of Good Seats Still Available. Thank you for listening. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.